Dr. Friedrich Müller stared at the medical supply shelf, his breath caught somewhere between his throat and his chest. Rows of penicillin vials, dozens of them, sitting casually on a wooden rack in a prisoner of war camp. Small glass bottles with handwritten labels lined up like soldiers at attention. In Germany, he had watched 17 men die for lack of this drug. 17 soldiers whose wounds had festered, whose fevers had climbed, whose families would receive letters with careful lies about heroic deaths. He had held their hands as sepsis claimed them, one fever-racked hour at a time. Here, in enemy captivity, behind barbed wire in the middle of nowhere, it was treated like aspirin. His fingers traced the label on one vial. The date stamped on the bottom was from 3 weeks ago, fresh, abundant, casually restocked. This single shelf of medicine, more penicillin than his entire field hospital had seen in 2 years of war, would shatter everything he believed about superiority, about who was winning, about who had already won. But this was only the beginning of what Captain Eric Weber and his men would discover on their first day in America. What they found would challenge every propaganda speech, every rally, every promise their leaders had made, and it would start with something as simple as a cup of cold water in the Oklahoma heat. August 12, 1944. The flat prairie of Oklahoma stretched endlessly in all directions, grass the color of old brass, shimmering under a sun that felt different from any European sky. Heat rose in visible waves, bending the horizon into something liquid and uncertain. Captain Eric Weber first saw the convoy as dark specks vibrating in those waves. Then came the sound, the deep mechanical growl of army trucks, the metallic clatter of canteens against wooden rifle stocks, the rhythmic grinding of gears shifting down. Dust followed them like a weather front, a brown cloud that announced their arrival miles before they reached the camp perimeter. Inside the first canvas-covered truck, 30 men sat in faded field gray uniforms that had once been crisp, once been symbols of an invincible machine. Now the fabric was stained with salt rings from sweat, worn thin at the elbows, patched at the knees. They were gaunt, not starving, but lean in the way men become when meals are uncertain and fear burns calories faster than marching. Weber sat in the back corner counting seconds. It was a habit he had developed during the Atlantic crossing, when time felt both endless and precarious. 37 days since capture near Cherbourg. 18 days crossing the ocean in the hold of a Liberty ship, where the only certainty was the smell of diesel and vomit. 5 days in processing camps where they had been photographed, fingerprinted, cataloged like library books. And now this, Oklahoma, America. The rumors had traveled with them, whispered in German between men who tried to maintain dignity while their world collapsed. Americans hate us? They will starve us in the desert. We will be worked to death in mines. We will be shot for sport. The propaganda had prepared them for enemies who were soft, decadent, jazz-obsessed, and morally weak. But whispered stories from other prisoners painted a different picture, one of casual violence, of lynch mobs, of a country that had seen newsreels of bombed cities and wanted revenge. The convoy slowed. Through gaps in the canvas, Weber caught glimpses of the camp, rows of wooden huts under white tarp roofs, straight lines of barracks that spoke of military precision, watchtowers at each corner, but somehow they looked less menacing than expected. Not torture chambers, not execution grounds, just buildings. The truck jerked to a stop. The engine ticked as it cooled, a sound like a clock counting down to something inevitable. Weber heard the other men breathing, shallow, controlled breaths of men preparing for violence. All right, fellas, unload. Slowly. Line up in twos. The voice came from outside, speaking English with an accent Weber couldn't place. Southern, he would learn later. Oklahoma drawl? But in that moment he was listening for tone more than words. Was it cruel? Mocking? Eager? It was simply tired, hot, matter of fact. When 30 men froze, uncertain, the voice added, "Come on, gentlemen, welcome to Oklahoma." The word welcome landed like a physical object among them. Weber saw Private Hansdecker, who had been preparing to jump down with fists clenched, pause mid-motion, saw Lieutenant Otto Brandt's face flicker with confusion. Welcome, not get out. Not move, prisoner scum. Welcome. Sergeant Major Bill Jenkins stood beside the truck, a clipboard in one hand and a canteen in the other. He was perhaps 40 years old, with sun-weathered skin, and eyes that had seen enough of life to be unimpressed by most of it. His uniform was clean, but not pressed, practical rather than parade ground perfect. He watched the Germans descend one by one with the air of a man supervising a delivery of furniture rather than enemy soldiers. Weber was the last to step down. His boots hit Oklahoma soil, red clay mixed with grass, nothing like the mud of France or the sand of Africa. He straightened his collar instinctively, a gesture toward the officer he had been trained to be, and caught the scent of sagebrush carried on a hot wind. Also gasoline, canvas, and something else, something green and alive that didn't exist in war zones. The camp revealed itself as they were marched toward the processing building. Each step showed more details that contradicted expectation. The barracks were painted, not freshly, but maintained. Windows had screens. The ground between buildings was graded and drained. At the far end, he could see what looked like a recreation area with benches under shade structures. It looked like a military installation. It did not look like a place men were sent to die. "Names and ranks," Jenkins called, his voice carrying the practiced authority of an NCO who had done this many times. "We'll get you processed, fed, and assigned bunks. Anyone need medical attention? Speak up now." The Germans exchanged glances. This was the trap, surely. Admit weakness and be separated from the group. Admit injury and be marked for something worse. No one spoke. Jenkins sighed, a sound of infinite patience tested. "All right, your choice. But we got doctors, and they're bored. You'll see them anyway during intake exams." As they lined up for name recording, a rumble interrupted from the direction of the mess hall. Two cooks pushed a cart loaded with steel containers, and the smell that preceded them made Weber's stomach clench with sudden painful hunger. Beef stew. Fresh bread. Real coffee, not the acorn-roasted substitute they'd choked down for the last 2 years. A corporal shouted, "Lunch for transport detail and guests. Don't let it spoil in this heat." There was that word again, guests. Weber reached the head of the line where a young private sat with a ledger, carefully recording information with the concentration of someone who took paperwork seriously. The private looked up, made eye contact, and thrust out a metal cup. "Drink up, sir. It's filtered and cold. We got a well that pulls from deep enough to stay cool even in August." The cup was already sweating condensation. Weber took it automatically, his training in accepting what was offered, warring with his suspicion of poison or worse. The liquid inside was so cold it hurt his teeth. Clean, sharp, with a mineral tang that tasted like it came from stone rather than rivers that had flowed through battlefields. It was the first cold water he had tasted in 6 weeks. He drank it without meaning to, his body overriding his caution, and only realized he'd drained the entire cup when the private refilled it without comment. "Take your time," the young soldier said. "Dehydration's no joke out here. Lost 2 guards to heat stroke last summer before we learned to be careful." The casual admission that Americans also suffered, also made mistakes, also were vulnerable to the same sun, landed somewhere in Weber's chest where ideology lived. It was a small thing, a crack in the foundation. But cracks, he would learn, were how light got in, and if you're wondering how this moment, this simple cup of water, would begin unraveling everything these men believed about the war, about superiority, about who they were, and who they had been fighting, hit that like button. Because what happens next will show you that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet. It's basic human decency. The architecture of Captivity Camp Swift sprawled across 200 acres of Oklahoma grassland, a temporary city of wood and canvas that had been constructed with American efficiency and maintained with military precision. Colonel Robert Taylor commanded it with the careful attention of a man who understood that his job was not punishment, but custody, His office held a single decoration beyond the standard military furniture, a framed quote from the Geneva Convention, underlined twice in red ink. Prisoners of war are in the hands of the enemy power, but not of the individuals or formation which captured them. Taylor, a veteran of the First War who had seen what hatred did to men on both sides, had added his own annotation in the margin. Hatred is contagious. Do not spread it. This was not sentiment. It was policy. The camp ran on schedules that would have been familiar to any soldier. 0600 Reveille, formation at 0630, work details beginning at 0700. But the details were different in ways that Weber and his men discovered hour by hour, day by day, each discovery another brick removed from the wall of what they had believed. The barracks were clean, not empty clean, but maintained clean, with wooden floors that had been swept that morning, and bunks that came with 2 wool blankets and a pillow. Real pillows, stuffed with something softer than straw. Corporal James Mitchell, who had been assigned as their liaison, led the group through the orientation with the practiced boredom of someone who had done this 50 times before. Latrines at the end. Showers are on a rotation schedule, so everyone gets hot water. You'll work 6 days a week, Sundays off. Pay is 80 cents a day in camp scrip. You can use it at the canteen for cigarettes, soap, writing paper, whatever. Mail privileges once you've been cleared by intelligence. Fights get you 3 days in isolation. Escape attempts get you transferred to a higher security facility where things are less comfortable. Questions? Silence. The Germans were still processing the concept of pay, of canteens, of mail privileges. Look, Mitchell said, his tone shifting slightly towards something more human. I know you heard stories on the way here. I know you're expecting something different. But this is a work camp, not a punishment camp. Colonel Taylor runs it by the book, and the book says you get treated decent as long as you act decent. We got 300 German prisoners here already who figured that out. Life here is boring. The food's not exciting, but nobody's getting beat, and nobody's starving. That's the deal. He paused, seeming to debate whether to add something, then shrugged. Also, the local farmers who you'll work for mostly treat you pretty good. They're short-handed because of the war, and they need help bringing in cotton. They'll offer you lemonade in the afternoon. Take it. Heat stroke's real, and we don't need to file paperwork when you collapse. With that practical benediction, he left them to settle in. Weber chose a bunk near the window where he could see both the compound yard and the horizon beyond the fence. As he folded his spare shirt, his only spare shirt, he watched other prisoners returning from work details. They moved without the beaten-down shuffle of men expecting violence. Some were laughing. One group was playing cards in the shade of a barracks overhang. "This is the soft part," Otto Brandt muttered from the next bunk. "Before they break us properly, show us comfort, then take it away." Classic interrogation technique. Weber wanted to believe that. It would make more sense than the alternative, that this was simply what captivity looked like in America, that the propaganda had been lying about who the enemy was. But then, dinner happened. The spike moment. The mess hall. The mess hall could seat 500 men, and currently held perhaps half that. Guards, administrative staff, and the new arrivals mixed together in a way that would have been impossible to imagine in any German facility. Americans ate with their prisoners, not at separate tables under watchful eyes, but at the same tables, passing salt and bread without ceremony. Weber moved through the line with a metal tray that was clean but scarred from use. The cook behind the counter, a black man named Jackson, whose forearms were decorated with old burned scars from years of kitchen work, ladled beef stew without looking up. Bread's on the table. Coffee's self-serve. Don't take more than you'll eat. The portion was enormous. Weber stared at it, doing quick arithmetic. This was perhaps 800 calories on his tray, for one meal. German soldiers on the Eastern Front had been subsisting on 400 calories a day when supply lines broke down. He knew men who had fought for a jar of preserves, who had stolen from corpses for a piece of sausage. This was one meal, one of 3. Hans Decker, behind him in line, whispered in German, "This is for a week, yes. We divide it between us. Between... The cook apparently understood German, or understood the tone, because he looked up with eyes that had seen too much to be patient with stupidity. That's for you. Today. There's more if you want seconds, but you're going to work it off tomorrow in 100-degree heat, so you'll need it. They sat. They ate. The stew was simple. Beef, potatoes, carrots, onions cooked until soft. But it was the first hot meal many of them had eaten that wasn't from a can. The bread was white bread, soft and slightly sweet, utterly unlike the dense brown loaves of home. And there was butter. Real butter, not the margarine substitute they'd been issued since 1942. A small pat of it, wrapped in wax paper, sitting beside the bread plate like it was nothing special. Weber spread it slowly, watching it melt into the warm bread, and took a bite that tasted like peace tasted, like a world where dairy products weren't rationed, like a country that had so much food it could feed its enemies without flinching. Across the table, Sergeant Walter Hoffman was crying silently into his stew, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. No one mentioned it. They were all doing their own mathematics, calculating what this meal meant about the war they had been fighting. The cracks were getting wider. Dr. Müller and the medicine shelf. 3 days into their captivity, Dr. Friedrich Müller was escorted to the camp infirmary for his intake medical examination. He had been dreading this, expecting humiliation, rough hands, questions designed to break rather than heal. Instead, he met Captain David Chen, Medical Corps, who had graduated from Stanford in '37, and spoke with the careful precision of someone who had chosen his words in multiple languages. The infirmary was a converted barracks with proper examination rooms, clean floors that smelled of carbolic acid and something medicinal he couldn't identify. Sunlight came through windows that had actual curtains. On one wall hung anatomical charts in English. On another, a list of scheduled vaccinations for the camp population. Dr. Müller, Chen said, reading from a file. Field Hospital 327 Eastern Front, studied at Heidelberg, board certified in 1933. He looked up. I'm told you speak English. Some, Müller replied carefully. His English was functional but academic, learned from textbooks rather than conversation. Good, have a seat. This is just standard intake. I'll check your vitals, look for any immediate health concerns, update your vaccination status. Should take 20 minutes. Chen moved through the examination with professional efficiency. Blood pressure, pulse, lung sounds, checking for hernias or old injuries. His hands were impersonal but not rough. He noted a badly healed fracture in Müller's left wrist, asked about it, accepted the explanation without judgment. You'll want to see our dentist, Chen remarked, shining a light into Müller's mouth. Couple of cavities that'll get worse if we don't address them. Also, that molar is cracked. We can save it with a crown, but it'll need attention within the next month. Müller blinked. You have a dentist. 2. One's Army, one's civilian contract. They're both bored because we finally got all the guards processed. They'll be happy to have work. Chen made a note. I'll put you on the schedule. As Chen completed the exam, Müller's eyes wandered around the infirmary, cataloging what he saw with the trained observation of someone who had worked in field hospitals where supplies were measured in desperation, shelves stocked with bandages, gauze, tape, glass cabinets containing surgical instruments that gleamed under overhead lights, an X-ray machine, an actual X-ray machine, sitting in the corner like it was standard equipment. And then he saw the shelf. 3 rows of small glass bottles, each labeled in English with names he recognized from medical school, from journals, from desperate prayers over dying men. Sulfa drugs, morphine, ether. And there in the middle row at least 40 vials of something that made his breath stop. Penicillin. His hands started shaking before he realized they were moving. He stood without permission, walked to the shelf like a man in a dream, and reached out to touch one vial with a fingertip that trembled. Chen looked up from his notes. Something wrong. Müller couldn't speak at first. His throat had closed around words that were too large for his mouth. When he finally managed sound, it came out rough and broken. "How do you have this?" "Have what?" "The penicillin?" Chen glanced at the shelf like Miller had pointed out wallpaper. "Standard supply. We get shipments monthly." "Why?" "Monthly," Miller repeated. The word felt obscene. "You receive penicillin monthly." "Yeah, sometimes more if we request it. Had a batch of respiratory infections last winter. They sent us extra." Chen was watching him now with more attention, his doctor's eyes seeing something beyond the physical. "Dr. Miller, when's the last time you saw penicillin?" "Never." The word came out as a whisper. "I have never seen it, only read about it. We were told it existed, but that it was scarce, that the Americans and British were hoarding what little they had for their own troops." Chen was very still now. "How many men did you lose to infected wounds?" 17. "That I watched die. More that I didn't." Miller turned to face him, and something in his face must have been raw, because Chen's expression softened into something like compassion. 17 men whose wounds were not fatal, whose injuries could have been managed, but infection took them because we had nothing. We cleaned wounds with alcohol. We amputated to prevent sepsis. We prayed." He looked back at the shelf. "You have 40 vials here. 40. I calculated once that 3 vials would have saved Fisher, 5 would have saved Schmidt, 7 for Adler because his wound was larger." "I'm sorry," Chen said quietly, and he meant it. It was there in his voice. Genuine sorrow for men he'd never met, deaths he didn't cause, suffering that wasn't his fault. Miller laughed, but it was the sound of something breaking. "You're sorry. You have a shelf full of medicine that could have saved 100 men, and you're sorry." "Yes." Chen stood, walked over to join him at the shelf, and picked up 1 vial. "This drug, it's being mass-produced now. We've got factories making it by the ton. Every field hospital has it. Every aid station. It's as common as aspirin in our supply chain. That's not hoarding. That's industrial capacity." He handed the vial to Miller. "Keep it. I'll replace it from stock." Miller held the small glass bottle like it was made of spider silk and prayers. The liquid inside was slightly amber, unremarkable. Ordinary? Common. "Your war is already over," he said, not looking up from the vial. "You just haven't told our generals yet." Chen's smile was sad. "No." "Your generals know?" "They're just not telling you." The cotton fields work began on Monday. 50 prisoners loaded into trucks before dawn, driven out to farms where cotton grew in fields that stretched to the horizon. The farmers were old men and young boys, everyone else being overseas or in factories, and they regarded their German laborers with the same practical assessment they gave any hired help. Mr. Harold Peterson, who owned 600 acres outside of Stillwater, gathered his crew, 12 Germans and his 16-year-old grandson Tommy, and explained the job with the economy of someone who had done this every August since he was old enough to drag a sack. Cotton needs picking. You fill the sacks, empty them in the trailer, repeat. It's hot work, it's hard on the back, and you'll have white fluff in places you didn't know you had by the end of the day. Take water breaks when you need them. Tommy will bring lemonade around mid-morning and again after lunch. Otto Brandt raised his hand hesitantly. "What happens if we refuse?" Peterson looked at him with the expression of a man who had seen droughts, dust storms, and the Depression, and was therefore unimpressed by theoretical rebellion. "Then you sit under that tree in the shade while the rest work. And tonight Colonel Taylor gets a report that you refused work detail. I think he gives you a week in isolation on reduced rations for first offense. But mainly you'd be letting down these other fellas who'd have to pick up your slack. Your choice." He turned and headed toward the field. "Tommy, bring out the sacks. Let's get started before it gets really hot." The work was exactly as hard as promised. Weber had been a soldier, was accustomed to physical labor, but this was different, repetitive, endless, requiring a bent-over posture that made his back scream within the first hour. His hands, soft from weeks of captivity and transport, began to blister. But Tommy Peterson did bring lemonade, Real lemonade, tart and cold from an ice chest, served in paper cups with the casual generosity of someone who had never considered that enemies might not deserve drinks on a hot day. "You Germans ever pick cotton before?" Tommy asked, making conversation with the fearlessness of 16-year-old boys who didn't yet understand that war should make men into monsters. "No," Weber replied, grateful for the excuse to straighten his spine. "This is new." "You'll get faster. My dad, he's in France right now. He says you guys are good workers once you figure out the rhythm. Says German soldiers are usually pretty organized." The casual mention of Tommy's father fighting in Europe, delivered without malice, was another small crack. This boy's father was possibly shooting at Weber's countrymen at this very moment, and yet here they were, sharing lemonade like co-workers. By lunch, Weber had filled 17 sacks. His hands were bleeding slightly where blisters had popped. His shirt was soaked through with sweat. He sat in the shade of the truck and ate the sandwich Mrs. Peterson had sent. Ham, cheese, lettuce, more food than he'd eaten for lunch in 2 years, and watched Harold Peterson examine the day's progress with a farmer's critical eye. "Not bad for first-timers," Peterson called. "You keep this pace. We'll finish this field by Friday. Means you'll get your full pay, and I'll tell Taylor you earned it." "Why do you care?" Otto Brandt asked, the question coming out more aggressively than he probably intended. "We're prisoners, enemies. Why not work us until we drop?" Peterson took off his hat, wiped sweat from his forehead, and regarded Brandt with eyes that had seen dust storms bury crops and banks foreclose on neighbors. "Son, I don't give a damn about politics. I care about my farm. My cotton needs picking, and I'm short-handed because this war took every able-bodied man under 40. You want to work? You get treated like workers. You want to be enemies? You can sit in that camp and rot. But my cotton doesn't care what country you're from. It needs picking either way." He put his hat back on. "Plus, it's 103 degrees today. Working a man to death in this heat would be stupid and wasteful. I need you back here tomorrow." Pure pragmatism. No ideology, no grand statements about democracy or freedom. Just a farmer who needed his crops harvested and enough basic decency to offer water to the men doing the work. Weber found this more devastating than any propaganda speech about American values. This wasn't planned. It wasn't policy. It was simply how things were done. Sunday baseball. The idea came from Sergeant Mitchell, who had noticed that Sunday afternoons tended to get tense as men with nothing to do started picking fights or nursing grievances. He proposed to Colonel Taylor that they organize a baseball game, guards versus prisoners, as a way to burn energy and break tension. Taylor approved it with the stipulation that the prisoners be taught the rules first, since he refused to referee an international incident caused by confusion about what constituted a strike. The first game happened 3 weeks into the new prisoners' arrival. The field was a rough diamond scratched into the dirt near the recreation area, bases marked with burlap sacks filled with sand. Equipment was mismatched, bats from various sources, gloves that had seen better days, a ball that was more tape than leather. Weber, who had never played baseball, found himself in right field through a process that seemed to involve shouting and enthusiastic pointing. The rules, as explained by Mitchell between innings, made a kind of sense once you stopped trying to apply logic and just accepted that Americans enjoyed complicated ways of hitting things with sticks. Private Decker pitched for the German team with the fierce concentration of someone determined to prove something. His first pitch went wild, sailing over the batter's head and hitting the backstop with a sound like a gunshot. His second pitch was hit with a crack that sent the ball arcing toward the outfield where Weber stood, frozen in the sudden realization that he was expected to catch it. He missed. The ball hit the ground 10 feet to his left, bounced twice, and rolled toward the fence while the American batter rounded the bases with the enthusiastic cheering of men who found this all hilarious. "You'll get the next one," Mitchell shouted from first base, his encouragement genuine. The next hit came straight at Weber, and this time instinct took over. He stuck out his hands, felt the impact sting his palms, and somehow held on. The ball stayed in his glove. He had caught it. The German team erupted in cheers that had nothing to do with nationalism and everything to do with the simple joy of winning a game. Weber jogged back toward the infield, grinning like an idiot, and found himself clapped on the back by Otto Brandt, who was laughing so hard he could barely stand. They lost the game, 17-9. Nobody cared. Afterward, they sat in the shade drinking water and eating watermelon that Jackson had brought out from the mess hall, great triangular slices that dripped juice and seeds and tasted like summer in ways that transcended borders. "You Germans play soccer, right?" Tommy Peterson asked. He'd come to watch with his grandfather and stayed to fraternize with the same casual friendliness he brought to everything. "Maybe we could learn that next. Seems only fair." "Football," Otto corrected automatically, then caught himself. "Yes, Fuseball. We could teach you." "Deal. Next Sunday you teach us football, then we play another baseball game. Make it a tradition." A tradition. The word implied a future, implied continuity, implied that this strange peace they'd found behind barbed wire might last beyond the temporary. Weber lay in his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, and tried to reconcile the person he had been 6 weeks ago with the person who had spent his afternoon playing children's games with enemy soldiers and enjoyed it. The cognitive dissonance was painful. Everything he'd been taught said this was weakness, that fraternization with the enemy was corruption. But it didn't feel like corruption. It felt like being human again, the top moment, the surgery. It happened 5 weeks into their captivity on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Reveille, formation, work details. But then Private Hans Decker collapsed in the cotton field, crying out as his leg buckled beneath him. The infection had been building for days, Weber realized as he helped carry Decker to the truck. A small cut on his shin, barely noticeable, probably from barbed wire. Decker had hidden it, maybe out of fear, maybe out of pride, maybe because in their old world showing weakness meant being left behind. Now the skin around the wound was red and hot, with angry red streaks climbing toward his knee. Sepsis. Blood poisoning. Weber had seen it kill men in 4 days. They drove fast back to camp, and Decker was taken directly to the infirmary, where Dr. Chen met them at the door, took one look at the leg, and started issuing orders in the calm, rapid tone of someone who had done this many times. "Prep surgery 2. Get me a full course of penicillin, at least 70 doses. Start an IV with saline and glucose. Someone find Dr. Miller. He should assist since he knows the patient." Miller arrived within minutes, scrubbed quickly, and followed Chen into the surgery where Decker lay on a table under harsh white lights that turned everything into a stage. The young private's face was flushed with fever, his eyes glassy but trying to focus. "Am I going to die?" Decker asked in German, the question coming out small and young. Miller took his hand. "No. They have medicine. They have everything." Chen worked with practiced efficiency, cutting away dead tissue, flushing the wound, his hands steady as he cleaned infection that had burrowed deep into muscle. Miller assisted, passing instruments, holding retractors, watching with the clinical part of his mind that couldn't stop cataloging the resources being used. Sterile gloves, disposable, fresh sutures, electric cautery, proper surgical lights. And the penicillin, dose after dose, more antibiotic than Miller had used in his entire career, administered without hesitation or paperwork or bureaucratic delay. They worked for 2 hours. When Chen finally stepped back, stripping off his gloves, the wound was clean, closed, and Decker's leg was still attached. "He'll need bed rest for a week, IV antibiotics for 5 days, then oral for another 10. But he'll keep the leg, and he'll live." Chen looked at Miller across the operating table. "Clean infection. Caught early enough. Straightforward." "Straightforward," Miller repeated. His voice cracked on the word. "You just used enough penicillin to save 20 men for one private, one prisoner." "Yes. Why?" Chen was quiet for a moment, pulling off his surgical cap, his black hair disheveled underneath. When he spoke, his voice was soft but firm. "Because he's a patient. Because I took an oath. Because we have the medicine and he needed it. Because it's the right thing to do. He paused. Pick whichever reason makes sense to you. We wouldn't have done this, Miller said. The admission hurt coming out, like pulling shrapnel from a wound. If you were our prisoner, if roles were reversed, we wouldn't have spent these resources. We would have let him die or amputated without anesthetic to save time. I know. Chen's eyes were sad but not judgmental. I've seen the reports from liberated camps. I know what you did, what your country did. Then why? Because we chose to be different. Chen washed his hands in the steel sink, methodical and thorough. War makes everyone into monsters if you let it. The way you resist that is by choosing every single time to be human, even when it's hard, even when it costs something, even when the person you're saving wouldn't do the same for you. He dried his hands, turned to face Miller fully. You want to know the real difference between us. It's not industry or resources or tactics. It's this. We decided that our values matter more during war than during peace. That's when they actually mean something, when they're expensive, when they're inconvenient, when they cost 70 doses of penicillin for an enemy soldier. Miller stood there in the surgical bay, surrounded by equipment and medicine and the steady beep of a heart monitor tracking Decker's pulse, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. Everything he had believed about racial superiority, about the weakness of democracy, about the destiny of nations, dissolved in the face of one simple truth. The country he had been taught to despise was saving his comrade's life, while his own country would have let him die for the sake of efficiency. It was never about strength, he said quietly. It was always about this. About choice. Chen nodded. Now you're starting to understand. And if this moment hit you the way it hit Dr. Muller, if you're realizing that the most powerful victories aren't won on battlefields, but in operating rooms and baseball fields and cotton farms, subscribe to this channel. Because these are the stories they don't teach in history class. The moments that changed everything, not through violence, but through the radical act of treating enemies like human beings. Now let's see what happened when these men finally confronted the full truth of the war they'd been fighting. The photographs. It came in December when the autumn heat had finally broken and Oklahoma evenings turned cool enough to need jackets. Colonel Taylor gathered all 300 prisoners in the mess hall for what he called a mandatory educational session. The projector had been set up, the lights dimmed. Weber sat near the back with the men from his barracks, unsure what to expect. Maybe propaganda films about American military might. Maybe training films about post-war reconstruction. Maybe even entertainment. They'd been shown a Charlie Chaplin film the previous month. Taylor stood at the front, his face grave in the projector's reflected light. Gentlemen, what I'm about to show you was filmed by our soldiers as they liberated concentration camps in Germany and Poland. Some of you may not believe what you see. Some of you may believe you already know. But every man in this room will watch, because this is what your country did. This is what you fought for, whether you knew it or not. The first image appeared on the screen. Weber's mind couldn't process it at first. His brain kept trying to make it make sense, kept searching for an explanation that wasn't the obvious one. Those couldn't be bodies stacked like cordwood. That couldn't be a pit filled with human remains. Those skeletal figures behind wire couldn't be people. They looked like photographs from medical textbooks, from famine documentation, from impossible nightmares. But they were people, or had been. The images continued. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Names that meant nothing to most of them became synonymous with something that had no adequate words. Children's shoes in piles, eyeglasses sorted by the thousands, gold teeth extracted and collected, bodies so thin that ribs stood out like xylophone keys, eyes that looked at the camera with something beyond suffering, a kind of emptiness that came from witnessing the end of the world. In the darkness, Weber heard men crying, heard someone vomiting in the corner, heard Otto Brandt beside him whispering 999 like a prayer that might change reality. An American soldier narrated in English, his voice flat with exhausted horror. This is what we found at Dachau on April 29, 1945. Approximately 32,000 prisoners, most suffering from typhus and starvation. The crematoriums were still operating when we arrived. The crematoriums, industrial murder, mechanized and efficient, the same German efficiency they'd been taught to take pride in turned toward genocide. Müller sat frozen, his medical training making everything worse because he could see exactly what had been done to these bodies. Systematic starvation, disease left untreated, experimentation. His profession, his oath, his entire understanding of healing, all corrupted and inverted into something demonic. The lights came up. 300 men sat in absolute silence, faces wet with tears, or frozen in shock, or twisted with the effort of maintaining denial against overwhelming evidence. Taylor's voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. Some of you will say you didn't know. Maybe that's true. Maybe you were on the front lines, or in Africa, or in places where this information didn't reach you. But your country knew. Your leaders knew. And now you know. He paused, letting that settle. I'm not showing you this to punish you. I'm showing you this because you need to understand what you're going back to. Because when this war ends, and it will end soon, you'll go home to a country that did this. And you'll have to decide who you're going to be. Whether you're going to be the people who say, I didn't know, and let it happen again. Or whether you're going to be the people who say, never again, and mean it. He gestured to the blank screen. We've treated you well here, fed you, given you medicine, paid you for your work, treated you like human beings despite the fact that your country was doing this to millions of people. We did that because we believe that's what civilization means. Not just being civilized to people who look like you or think like you, being civilized to everyone, even your enemies, especially your enemies, because that's when it actually costs something. Taylor's voice hardened slightly. You wanted to know why we gave Private Decker 70 doses of penicillin, why we gave Dr. Müller the medicine he needed, why we feed you the same rations we feed our guards. This is why. Because the alternative is what you just saw. And we refuse to become that, no matter who we're fighting. He left them sitting there in the mess hall, 300 men confronting the fact that they had been fighting for monsters. The letters home, Weber wrote his first letter that night, though he knew it would be read by censors, would maybe never reach his wife, would certainly be inadequate to contain what he needed to say. My dearest Greta, I cannot write what I want to write. I cannot tell you what I saw today. But I can tell you this. Everything we believed was a lie. Everything we were told about strength and destiny and the necessity of our cause. It was all built on an obscenity so large I have no words. The Americans here feed us 3 meals a day. They gave us medicine when we were sick. They pay us for our work and treat us with a courtesy we do not deserve. And I finally understand why. It's not weakness. It's the opposite of what we were taught to value. I don't know what I'm coming home to. I don't know if there will be a home. But I know I am not the man who left. The person writing this letter is someone different, someone who has seen what we became, and must now decide who to be next. I love you. I don't know if I have the right to say that anymore, but I do. Always. Eric. Around him, other men were writing similar letters, or staring at blank paper, unable to find words, or refusing to write at all because acknowledgement felt like betrayal. Müller sat on his bunk, the vial of penicillin that Chen had given him months ago, sitting on the small shelf beside his bed. He picked it up, held it to the light, and saw in that small glass bottle everything that had broken and everything that might be rebuilt. A choice. That's what Chen had called it. The choice to save someone who might have let you die. The choice to be human when it was expensive and difficult, and when no one would have blamed you for choosing otherwise. He thought about the 17 men he had watched die for lack of this medicine, thought about the thousands in those photographs who had died not from accident or scarcity, but from deliberate cruelty, thought about the kind of country that mass-produced medicine and shared it with enemies versus the kind of country that industrialized death and called it destiny. The math was simple and devastating. One choice led to full medicine shelves and baseball games and lemonade in cotton fields. The other led to those photographs. Germany had chosen wrong. They had all chosen wrong, whether they knew it or not, whether they pulled triggers or just followed orders or simply looked away. Now they knew, and knowing changed everything. Winter in Oklahoma. The routine continued through winter. Cotton harvest gave way to other work, repairing fences, clearing land, helping with winter wheat preparation. The weather turned cold, and the prisoners received coats, gloves, wool socks. Real winter gear, not the threadbare substitutes they'd shivered in during Russian winters. Christmas came. The Americans decorated the mess hall with paper chains and a tree that Tommy Peterson had cut from his grandfather's property. There was turkey for dinner, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. A Protestant chaplain and a Catholic priest held services for those who wanted them. Chaplain Marshall, a Methodist minister from Tennessee who spoke some German, sat with Weber during the Christmas meal. "You thinking about home?" "Always," Weber admitted. "But I don't know what home means anymore." "It means what you make it mean," Marshall said, his drawl soft and contemplative. "War breaks things. People, places, ideas. But broken things can be rebuilt if you're willing to do the work. Different than before, maybe. But rebuilt." What if the damage is too deep? Then you dig deeper. You find a foundation that didn't break. Maybe family, maybe faith, maybe just the stubborn human refusal to give up. And you build on that. Marshall took a sip of coffee. Germany's going to need people who understand what happened and why it can't happen again. People who've seen both the worst and the best of humanity. Sounds like that might be you. Weber thought about that through the long winter evenings. Thought about it during work details and baseball games and quiet moments when the Oklahoma wind carried the smell of grass and distance. He thought about the shelf of penicillin and the surgery that saved Decker's leg and the photographs that broke their world. He thought about choice. Spring revelation. March brought warmth back to Oklahoma, and with it came news from Europe. The war was ending. Germany was collapsing under the weight of its sins and the Allied advance. Cities were falling, armies surrendering, the 1,000-year Reich dying after barely 12 years. The prisoners gathered around a radio in the recreation hall, listening to reports in English that some could understand, and others had translated. Berlin surrounded. Hitler dead. Surrender imminent. When the final announcement came on May 8th, Victory in Europe Day, the camp went quiet. The Americans celebrated, but carefully, aware that the men behind the wire were hearing about their country's death. Colonel Taylor restricted leave for guards and canceled the planned baseball game out of respect. Weber sat outside his barracks as the sun set, turning the Oklahoma sky orange and gold, and tried to feel something about Germany's defeat. He should feel grief, shouldn't he? Patriotic sorrow, anger. Instead, he felt relief. It was over. The machine that had built death camps and started wars and corrupted everything it touched had finally been destroyed. Otto Brandt found him there. They'd become friends over the months, united by shared disillusionment and the slow reconstruction of identity. "What do we do now?" Otto asked. "We go home," Weber said, "and we tell the truth. They won't want to hear it. No, but we tell them anyway." Weber looked at his friend. "We tell them about the medicine on the shelf, about the surgery for Decker, about the farmers who gave us lemonade, and the guards who played baseball with us, and the country that chose to be decent when it would have been easier to be cruel. We tell them that civilization isn't about who wins battles. It's about how you treat people when you have power over them. They'll call us traitors. Maybe. But we'll know what we saw. And maybe that's enough to start with." The return. They began shipping prisoners back to Europe in June. Weber's group left on a warm morning that felt like any other. Reveille, formation, breakfast. But this time they packed their belongings, received discharge papers, and lined up for transport to the train station. Colonel Taylor addressed them one final time. "Gentlemen, you're going home to a difficult situation. Your country is occupied. Your cities are destroyed. You'll face hardship and judgment and probably anger. But you're also going home with something valuable. Perspective. You've seen an alternative to what your country became. You know it's possible to build something better." He paused, looking at the assembled men with something like respect. "I don't expect you to love America. You don't have to. But I hope you'll remember what you learned here. And I hope you'll build something worth living in." As they loaded onto the trucks, Sergeant Mitchell shook each man's hand. Dr. Chen came to see them off, pressing a packet into Miller's hands: medical supplies, penicillin, bandages. "You'll need this more than we will." Tommy Peterson was there too, having driven in with his grandfather to say goodbye. He'd turned 17 in February, would probably be drafted soon if the Pacific War continued long enough. He waved at Otto Brandt, called out, "Good luck. Maybe I'll see you again sometime." The trucks pulled away, dust rising in their wake, and Weber watched Camp Swift disappear in the distance. The barracks where they'd slept, the mess hall where they'd eaten, the baseball field where they'd learned that enemies could laugh together. He touched the letter in his pocket, the one he'd finally finished writing to Greta. In it, he'd tried to explain the unexplainable, how captivity had set him free, how defeat had taught him truth, how the enemy had shown him what his own country should have been. The train ride to New York took 4 days. The ship crossing the Atlantic took 11. And then they were in Bremerhaven, stepping onto German soil that felt foreign and familiar all at once, returning to a country that existed but wasn't the one they'd left. Epilogue. The choice Dr. Friedrich Miller returned to his hometown of Heidelberg in July 1945. The city had survived relatively intact, but the country around it was broken in ways that had nothing to do with buildings. He opened a small practice in a borrowed room, using the supplies Chen had given him until they ran out. Then scrounging and improvising and making do. He never forgot the shelf of penicillin. When he spoke to medical students years later, he would tell them about that moment, seeing abundance in captivity, understanding through contrast what civilization actually meant. Medicine, he would say, is a moral choice before it's a technical one. You choose who deserves healing. Germany chose wrong. America chose right. Never forget which choice you're making. Captain Eric Weber rebuilt his life slowly, brick by brick, choice by choice. He found Greta in the chaos of post-war displacement. They had 3 children who grew up hearing stories about Oklahoma summers and baseball games and the country that treated enemies like guests. He never spoke about the photographs except to say, "This happened. We let it happen. We must never let it happen again." Private Hans Decker kept his leg, got married, and worked as a carpenter. He walked with a slight limp that reminded him daily of the surgery that saved him, of the 70 doses of medicine used on one unimportant prisoner, of the doctor who chose healing over efficiency. They all carried with them for the rest of their lives the knowledge that they had been wrong about everything that mattered, and that someone had been kind enough, civilized enough, decent enough to show them an alternative through simple acts of basic humanity. The war had been fought with bullets and bombs, won with industry and tactics. But this quieter victory, the one that happened in prison camps and cotton fields and operating rooms, lasted longer. It changed not just who won, but who they all became. Decades later, when historians would ask what made the American approach to prisoners different, the answer was always simple and always the same. They treated us like human beings, not because we deserved it, but because they believed that's what civilization required. They chose to be better than their enemies, not through strength, but through restraint, through medicine on shelves, through lemonade in fields, through the radical revolutionary act of basic decency. In the end, that's what defeated us. Not their weapons, but their values. Not their hatred, but their refusal to hate. And that made all the difference.